What is ADHD? What does that weird thing mean? How to know if I'm gay or not really okay? No thoughts left unsaid. We'll talk here instead. So come have a chat with Charlie.
Hello and welcome to the first proper episode of Chatting with Charlie. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about ADHD. More specifically, where did ADHD come from and why does it persist in humans today? If it's seen as something fairly negative, something that we do therapy for, not that therapy is inherently negative at all, but something that can cause problems, something that we've developed medication for. So how come it exists? And is ADHD really all that negative? Yeah, so for that, we'll talk about what ADHD is in general, what does it mean to have ADHD, and then we'll sort of deep dive into the backgrounds, specifically the evolutionary backgrounds. So if you're wondering if this sounds interesting to you, what sort of level is it going to be? Who's my target audience? Well, I mean, obviously, I'd like to say my target audience is everyone, so I'm going to try and keep it fairly basic in terms of scientific complexity. I'll try and explain terms that maybe some of you know and some of you don't know yet. But if there's anything that you feel like you would benefit from a further explanation, then feel free to DM me. Don't be embarrassed, don't be shy. I love chatting to people about it. Also, if you're questioning anything I say, please always question it. So talking of questioning, why the hell should you listen to me? Why should you believe everything I'm saying? Well, here I can say, please don't believe everything I'm saying. Don't sort of take it for granted. Don't take it for granted that what I'm saying is correct. Because you should question everything that you hear. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. But I haven't made up a whole load of random facts here. Might be quite fun, but it wouldn't be very scientific. No. So what are my qualifications? Well, I'm a human biology student, specifically evolutionary anthropology. So we're sort of looking at behaviors and traits of humans and thinking about where do they come from in terms of evolution. I also have ADHD, which means I'm very familiar with the symptoms, with the treatments. And now here, most importantly, I've tried to follow a scientific method. So everything that I'm saying is backed up by real studies, and I will provide you the links to these studies in the show notes, so you can further read about what I'm saying and also, fact check. Okay, now let's get into it. So what is ADHD? ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Now, what does that mean? We have lots of sort of weird stereotypes about what ADHD is. We think about overly bouncy primary school boys. We think about a disorder where, lots of people actually question, is it really a disorder, or is it just children being children? Is it children that can't sit for 10 hours in a classroom because that's not what children are supposed to do? And thinking about this is quite interesting if we look at it in evolutionary terms. Is it the result of people just not being able to sit still in a classroom? And here the answer is yes and no. ADHD is definitely a real thing. It is measurable. There are measurable brain differences, which we'll talk about later. There are genes which are thought to be associated with ADHD. And so there are measurable differences, and also if we look at people in terms of behavior, in terms of how they act, how they feel. And now, why is it a disorder? Lots of people like to say, ADHD is my superpower. And if you see it as your superpower, that's wonderful. But it can be problematic to tell other people that it's their superpower, because ADHD can have some negatives and it can affect the people. And why it does that we'll talk about now. So essentially, in ADHD, maybe we should talk about the acronym actually more before we start. So the attention deficit, just to clear up any misunderstandings, it stands for having a lack of attention, which means not being able to pay attention, not that these people are attention seeking. And then the hyperactivity, this can be physical or mental. So not everyone with ADHD is necessarily hyperactive in the way we think about it, always running around. This hyperactivity can be on a mental level. It can be thoughts racing. There's a quote that I quite like that says, I have ADHD. I've had more thoughts by breakfast than you have in the entire day. And that's sort of what it can feel like. Endless racing thoughts. If we think about our stereotypes again, ADHD is known as I have ADH. Oh, look, a squirrel. And again, maybe that's quite nice to visualize it, but it's not as simple as that. Because you should be distracted by a squirrel. Squirrels are amazing. If you see a squirrel walking past now when you are listening to my podcast, then please look at the squirrel. Okay, so that's sort of the very formal stuff. Now, what is ADHD? It's diagnosed by a whole load of behavioral and emotional symptoms which have to have existed since childhood. Otherwise, it's not ADHD. ADHD is something that has, as I just said, persisted since childhood. It's not an acquired behavior, and also it's not something that's, learned through, or it's not something you get through eating too much sugar or watching too much TV or all these things that people think about. So it is defined as a disorder, but many people with ADHD like thinking about it as a neurotype. So neurons are the nerve cells in your brain. Well, generally the nerve cells, but here talking about your brain and a type. So basically just a variety of what brains are like. And we do actually find differences in the brain, which is very, very interesting. So the main difference is in the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe. We see a weaker function here. So I promised you I would keep it in simple scientific terms, and now you might be thinking, what the hell is she going on about? Right, we know there's a weaker function and structure of the prefrontal cortex, but what does that mean? That is a very good question. So the prefrontal cortex, or the prefrontal association cortex, it plays a role in regulating behavior, regulating attention and emotion, and the right hemisphere, which is particularly affected, is specialized in behavioral inhibition. Okay, so that's very, very technical. But if we think about these things, so we have trouble regulating attention, that would be the attention, the deficit, then the difficulty regulating behavior. People with ADHD are often impulsive and explosive and do a million different things, and also particularly here behavioral inhibition, so maybe you're not thinking about all of the potential consequences. So if we think about what this means in real life terms, what are the criteria to be diagnosed by? We have carelessness and lack of attention to detail, continually starting new tasks before finishing old ones, poor organizational skills, continually losing or misplacing things, forgetfulness, restlessness and edginess, difficulty keeping quiet and speaking out of turn, blurting out responses and often interrupting others, mood swings, irritability, and a quick temper, the inability to deal with stress, extreme impatience, and taking risks in activities, often with little or no regard for personal safety. So these are the official symptoms in ADHD in adults by the NHS, so the National Health Society? That's probably not what NHS stands for. That's rather embarrassing. Services, sorry. National Health Services, which is the British sort of health thing. Oh dear, I'm sorry about that. That's highly professional, isn't it? That's something I probably should have looked up before. So sorry to all of my English listeners. Maybe an interesting fact for people that don't know me. I live in Austria. I am British, but I live in Austria and I have my whole life, so I don't know very much about the health services in England, so please. Oh dear, that's the ADHD speaking here. See, I did all the preparation for all the things that excited me. I looked up scientific sources and then messed up on the small ones. Right. Going back to the prefrontal cortex, we know that it's weaker structurally and in function. But why? What does that mean? Why does it work differently? So basically, it's highly dependent on the correct neurochemical environment for proper function. Now, I have read some studies, and it's incredibly complicated. So if you're interested, I can read the the direct quote to you. And if people are interested, I can do its whole episode about sort of the neurochemistry of ADHD, because it's thrilling and fascinating, but it's really complicated. And if I started to get into that now, this episode would be never ending, and I would probably lose my focus before I finished it. So for anyone that is interested in the neurochemistry, I will put the direct quote, exactly which molecules, which neurotransmitters, what is affected. I'll put it in the show notes. I can put the quote in for you, and I can also link the study. But for now, basically, if we sort of want to cut it down to something that is important, what is important? Important is dopamine. So scientists have found that the levels of dopamine are different in people with ADHD. And they've also found that the difference is because, so they found that these differences occur, and that people with unmedicated ADHD have higher concentrations of proteins called dopamine transporters. And the concentration of these proteins is known as dopamine transporter density. But just because we have higher or lower levels of these, we can't use this as a diagnostic tool at all. But that is something that we can see, that these levels are different depending on if someone has ADHD or not. So that's quite interesting. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter which you probably have heard of in terms of pleasure. So we can, sorry, I was fiddling and now I've made a hell of a lot of noise. Sorry about that. So you've heard about it in terms of pleasure. We can increase levels of dopamine by eating chocolate, doing exercise, and it does a lot more than that, but it stimulates some of these it stimulates these areas that we need, it stimulates the frontal lobe and other parts of the brain, but the ones we're focusing on for ADHD. And if we go back to our frontal lobe, I'd like to talk about some more concrete functions of the frontal lobe. So I told you in general before, what does it do, what does it affect, but what does it do concretely? So the frontal lobe controls high-level cognitive skills, for example, planning, self-control, memory formation, empathy, and attention. And also ones like emotional expression, problem solving, memory, language, judgment, and sexual behaviors. So all of these things can be affected in ADHD because our frontal lobe is slightly different than sort of the neurotypical brain. But there are other brain differences in people with ADHD as well. It's not just the frontal lobe. So the most important ones are the frontal lobe and the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia are a part of your brain, sort of kind of in the middle. Again, I'm probably not the best person for neuroanatomy, so if anyone who knows more about it than me is listening, I am incredibly sorry. But if we talk in very general terms, the basal ganglia are for motor control, as well as other things like motor learning, executive function, behaviors, and emotions. There's one important word here I would like to talk about, and that's executive function. So executive function means that you think you need to do something, and then you do it. So you think, oh, I need to take a shower, and then you get up and take a shower. We take executive functioning for granted until we lose it. So a loss of executive functioning, which we would call executive dysfunction, is very common in mental illness. So if you've ever had bouts of depression or whatever, it can be a huge problem. So that's the phenomenon of lying on the couch and thinking, I need to shower. I want to shower, I feel disgusting and I need to do it, but you just can't start your brain, you can't just get up and do it. And this can be incredibly frustrating and can be seen as lazy and not great. And if you struggle with executive functioning, it has a really big impact on your life. So if you see people that have difficulties with seemingly basic tasks, please don't judge them. And again, I'm trying very hard to stay neutral and not judging, and I would ask you to do the same. So this doesn't mean, obviously, that people with ADHD can't shower or can't do whatever, but that means there is sort of a higher incidence of having difficulty with, I don't know, being slightly chaotic, etc. in people with ADHD. And again, this doesn't mean that everyone who is messy has ADHD or everyone with ADHD has to be messy. But sometimes you can be trying as hard as you possibly can and still have difficulties. So thinking about the basal ganglia, there is one part of the brain that I would like to focus on specifically, which is the thalamus, which is necessary for several things, ranging from relaying sensory and motor signals, as well as regulation of consciousness and alertness. And in people with ADHD, the thalamus is bigger. So what does that mean? A bigger thalamus means that you have more connections and that it works differently. So we have connections from the thalamus to other parts of the brain, and it's sending these signals. And so if you think about it, you're sitting here, you're listening to my podcast, maybe you're on your way to work or school or wherever you're going, and you're probably concentrating mainly on my podcast. You can hear it, and maybe you're looking out at the window, maybe you can see some birds or some trees or some cars or whatever. But those are the main things that you're focusing on. But actually, if you think about what's happening, you're sitting in a chair and you can feel the chair against your butt and you can feel your feet on the floor and there are noises around you and there are 100 different things to see and there are thoughts in your head and you're listening to me and there's a million different things happening at once. And because that's quite a lot, your brain filters the most important ones. The ones you need to focus on, which in this case, hopefully, is listening to my podcast and getting out at the right stop. But if you have a bigger thalamus, you can have the problem that your brain isn't as good at filtering all of these different senses. So you might notice that someone with ADHD is hyper aware of a lot of things, which can lead to sensory overload quite easily. So the way I explained it before, everything that's happening at once, my brain, for example, is much worse at filtering all of these things out, which means that simple settings like sitting in a library, I'll be wanting to study, but then I'll get distracted because I can hear other people's pens scratching on paper and I can smell everything around me and I can hear things 3 rooms further on. And yeah, sometimes it feels as if your senses just work differently to other people's. And they don't. It doesn't give you superhuman hearing or superhuman sight, but sometimes it can feel like it does because your brain is not as great at filtering. And it can be incredibly good because I am incredibly attentive to detail it's not really if I want to be. It's not an active choice. But I can notice things that other people don't. But also, it's incredibly exhausting if you notice everything at every moment of every day. So that can lead to sensory overload, which is incredibly frustrating because other people don't understand it and they'll think maybe you're just making a fuss or whatever. So finally, let's get to evolution. We have talked about what ADHD is in great detail now. I hope I've sort of given you some corner points. Some cornerstones, some vague idea of what ADHD is. So let's talk about where did it come from? Where did it go? Where did it come from, Cotton Eye Joe? Oh dear. As you can maybe tell, the last episode was pretty scripted, and here I have got my notes, but I'm also oh dear, I am confused. Anyway. There's a very famous quote that every biologist knows, which is nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, which was said by Dubansky. So, as we've noticed, ADHD exists today and it hasn't died out. And everything I've been telling you doesn't really sound that great, does it? Someone who's very impulsive and doesn't really pay much attention and is constantly overwhelmed because they're seeing a million things at once. So why the hell does it even exist? Well, it exists today because it made sense at one point and there were benefits. So evolution basically happens by chance. There are random mutations, random things happen. You can't choose specifically what happens, but we say evolution has a direction. So only if a trait is useful, it is passed on. And how is a trait passed on? Well, basically it's passed on by mating and having offspring. So it needs to be something that you can, that is passed on through your genes. So if I chop off my leg and have a child, my child isn't going to be one-legged because me chopping off my leg is not something that's encoded in my genes. But ADHD, there are genes that are associated with it. So it can be passed on. So basically, if something is useful or neutral, it will be passed on. And you need to think this happens over thousands and millions of years. Evolution doesn't happen from one day to the next. So you can't optimize one trait because the optimum changes. It's dependent on a whole load of different things. For example, your environment. And then there are many adaptations or many traits that can be very helpful in one setting and very unhelpful in others. So there are certain illnesses, for example, if you think of sickle cell anemia, as the most famous biology example or medicinal example that every science student has to learn quite quickly. So sickle cell anemia, there are your red blood cells in your blood should be kind of disc-shaped, and if you have sickle cell anemia, they are sickle-shaped, so sort of half-moon-shaped, or actually less than half-moon-shaped. Yeah, anyway, and this means that the iron can't bond to your blood properly, which then makes it more difficult to carry oxygen, which you can probably tell isn't great. Anyone that's ever been anemic knows how awful you feel, and sickle cell anemia doesn't really sound that great, does it? Well, but if you have... as you know, we have, when genes are passed on, the mother and the father, or, well, the sperm and the egg cell, it doesn't really matter what gender the giver of these cells is, but the sperm and the egg cell, when they combine, you have a combination of the genes that are given to you. And if you have sort of one version which carries this sickle cell anemia and one that doesn't, then you don't actually have sickle cell anemia. You just carry the type, which means, or you carry this gene, which means you could pass it on to your children. And you technically could give them sickle cell anemia, but it also makes you immune to malaria. So if we look at this illness in Europe here, for example, where sickle cell anemia doesn't exist, it's not very helpful. So having these genes wouldn't be very helpful. So if we look at the incidences, we have much, much less of these genes here than we do in some regions in Africa, where having sickle cell anemia obviously is still bad, but being immune to malaria is incredibly helpful, because that can be an incredible advantage for surviving. Particularly, again, you need to think evolution happens slowly. So particularly in times where there wasn't modern medicine and where these things were absolutely not treatable, being immune is an incredible advantage. So here you see it depends on the environment. And basically, we call this a trade-off. So you have to accept something that's suboptimal because there are parts of it that are very beneficial. So this is why we can't make the perfect brain, because the perfect brain depends on a million different things. So you need to imagine ADHD when it I wanted to say was created, but it wasn't created, but when it sort of arose, people were hunters and gatherers. And if we look at these symptoms again now, they can partly be incredibly helpful. Imagine having someone who's driven and easily bored and always seeking novelty, someone who's creative and energetic and fast. Well, these things can be very, very helpful. Because in hunter-gatherer societies, people were generalists. They needed to know how to do a little bit of everything, and they needed to be flexible and adaptable. And all of these things now, so if we go back to these symptoms, many of them can be very, very helpful. So let's start with the sort of hyper-awareness for senses. If you feel like you can hear and see and smell things ages before other people do, it can be the difference between life and death. It can help you run away from the predator because you had that edge, you noticed it first. And always seeking novelty means that you'll be much more willing to try out a million different things. And yes, maybe abandoning things that aren't fun and that don't work, but it also means that you will probably be the person who will come up with the solution for the problem, which again is pretty great. And then difficulty keeping quiet, speaking out of turn. Some of these things that now in a classroom or an office setting are seen as something incredibly negative, they don't really matter if you're living in a cage. Again, if you're loud, if you're drawing attention to yourself, potentially, well, that's good because people notice you and people will see you as strong and potentially as a leader. Taking risks, often with little or no personal regard for safety. Well, the risk takers are the ones that survive because, yes, you might die, which isn't great, but you also might not die, and you're much more likely to try, and then you're much more likely to be the person who manages to kill the mammoth because you took the risk. So all of these things are very, very helpful. And if we go back to the frontal lobe and to ADHD and the treatments of ADHD, today we treat ADHD with stimulants. So these are different classes of drugs, different classes of medication that actually stimulate these parts of the brain. But when people are not medicated, they try to seek this stimulation. Not necessarily, it's not a conscious, active decision, but we said before that dopamine is an incredibly important part of this functioning, and dopamine can be increased by exercise, by sex, by food, by novelty. So basically this jumping from one exciting activity to the next, it gives us a boost of dopamine every time, which helps our brain function. So if we do all of these things, it can also lead to taking drugs, to self-medicating, to things that obviously aren't great. But basically what we're doing is looking for a little bit more dopamine. And if you think of this in terms of evolution, where, for example, there isn't food in the fridge at all times. Now in a modern society, the tendency maybe to overeat or to eat lots of high-calorie food can be seen as something that's not incredible and not incredibly great, and particularly if we're just using food for stimulation, it can have negative effects. But if you're living in a cave and you're seeking out food in order to survive, and you're sort of more driven than other people, then you're more likely to survive. And there have actually been studies in nomadic individuals, in actual tribes that exist now. They found that those who had a gene that is associated with ADHD, they remained more nourished compared to nomadic individuals without ADHD. So there have been several studies done where people have looked at tribes, for example, in Kenya, and they saw that the people that had these genes, they were able to survive longer, and they were healthier, they were more nourished. And also what is very, very interesting, if we look at these genes, then we also have a greater number in these tribes, in these nomadic members. And if we think back to our sickle cell anemia example, we said in populations, in areas, in peoples where it makes sense to have higher incidence of these genetic variations, they will occur. So again, this shows us that if we look at peoples today who live much more in a way that we lived in when these traits evolved, that it can be very, very beneficial. So if we think of ADHD, it can be seen as almost an evolutionary mismatch. So the reason that we succeeded in becoming who we are today is in part I'm sure due or thanks to people with ADHD, people who have these skills and these abilities and who think in these ways. And it's just not incredibly great in a classroom setting, for example. If we think about our stereotypical boy who can't sit still, and that's sort of the answer to my yes or no question at the beginning, is that assumption correct? Some final words if we think about if we think about this evolutionary mismatch. So it was important for me to tell you at the beginning that I do personally have ADHD because if you listen to this, I've listened to some podcasts about ADHD written and held by people who have all of the theoretical knowledge, but none of the lived experience. And it can come across as incredibly negative and incredibly, I don't know. I think it's always a bit, a bit problematic if we listen to something sort of almost as thrill-seeking. So I've heard of psychology lessons at school where the pupils were asked to choose one illness that they think is the most thrilling, and then they learnt about that. And mental illnesses and neurotypes, I'm trying to keep the distinction here because they are different in terms of how they arise and also what they are, but they're not something thrilling that we can study the same way that, tribes aren't something thrilling that are just there for us to study, for us to gain a deeper understanding. So we should be very grateful that these that these people now being people with ADHD and mental illnesses, that they are sort of willing to talk about their experiences, and that this research is done. I think that is something very important and also something very interesting, but you shouldn't look at other ethnicities, people from other countries, but also people with maybe a different neurotype to your own. Shouldn't look at them as zoo animals or just something fascinating for, academic and study purposes. They are people. We are people. And that's something that's very important for me to just get out there, because as much as I think this is absolutely fascinating, what happens in your brain, what happens on a neurochemical level, where did it come from, how has all of this arisen, it's important that we are thinking about real live human people and people that in lots of ways do suffer, because we do live in a society where these things aren't always seen as something positive and where it can be extremely difficult to cope. And I would like to try and keep this podcast sort of as authentic as possible whilst sticking to scientific research and, keeping it all science backed. But I will always talk about personal experiences and how it affects me as a person, because, I just want to reduce some of the stigma around these things, and also maybe help you understand what it is. Okay, well, I think I've been rambling on for quite enough time now, so thank you very much for listening. I'm really grateful to everyone who has taken the time to support me and listen, and of course, if you'd like to rate me, I would be very, very happy. That would be great. And also, I'm sorry if I stumbled over some words, and I'm sure there'll be things that I maybe didn't say quite correctly now in this podcast. So if you do have any questions or anything that you've noticed, please feel free to write to me, and I will give you all of the links that I used. I'll give you the proper scientific links, but I will also give you the Healthline links. So I said before that I'm a biology student. I wouldn't use Healthline in an essay or whatever, in a paper for uni, but I think for a podcast it's not bad because they do actually give sources, but they explain it in a more friendly way. So if you're truly interested, you can check out all of the links as well. And yeah, one last thing before I finally get to the end. If you'd like to follow me, you can follow me on my personal social media, which is on Instagram at Livy_Sophie, which is LIVVY_Sophie with PH and IE. Or you can follow the official Instagram for Chatting with Charlie, which is chatting_with_Charlie_. And Charlie is, again, with CH and IE at the end. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
And now, as this episode reaches the end, I would like to share something with you that makes me incredibly happy. Who wants a sausage?